Hey guys, tonight we drift gently, but unavoidably, into one of the most awkward family portraits in all of European history. Picture this: a candlelit royal chamber, stiff lace collars, and a nobleman who quite literally cannot shut his mouth, not out of arrogance or enthusiasm, but because his jaw simply won't cooperate. You're entering the world of the Habsburgs, a family so determined to keep their bloodline pure that their faces began to melt in protest. Your eyes soften in the warm light as you picture velvety halls echoing with court musicians and powdered wigs bobbing like meringues on a slow carriage ride. Everything is elegant until you reach the portraits. That's when you start noticing it. The protruding lower lip, the elongated chin, the unsettling slope where jaw meets neck. And yes, it's everywhere. You're about to spend your evening falling down a centuries-long rabbit hole of royal genetics, political ambition, questionable marriages, and a jaw so legendary it became its own Wikipedia category. You probably won't survive this genetically, but luckily you aren't a 16th century Austrian archduchess. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with your location and what time you're listening. We're building a sleepy little empire of our own. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge softly through the forests of medieval Switzerland, where the Habsburg name first begins to whisper itself into history. It's around the 11th century. Picture tall firs, the hush of hooves over dirt, and the sharp clink of chainmail as Rudolf I of Habsburg wanders into your timeline. He's not royalty yet, not even close, just a well-connected count with some lucky marriages and an eye for opportunity. The original Habsburgs were more good real estate decisions than they were emperors. Rudolf's family castle, Horbichsburg, or Hawk's Castle, perched in the Aargau region, is where the dynasty takes its name. The hawk is noble, majestic, focused, none of which describes the facial expressions that will define his descendants, but hey, symbolism is symbolic, not predictive. Rudolf climbs the feudal ladder thanks to the fact that other powerful families are either extinct, at war, or distracted. He ends up being elected King of Germany in 1273, mostly because the electors didn't think he'd be a threat. That classic backfiring move. Like choosing the quiet kid for group leader and suddenly he's running the whole school. Mainstream history marks this as the Habsburgs' official glow-up. But what textbooks don't always mention is that Rudolf's election also sets a strange precedent. Power in Europe, especially the Holy Roman Empire, could be elected, not inherited. And yet the Habsburgs would spend the next several centuries trying to pretend otherwise, marrying and plotting until it felt like divine right after all. You may start to feel a slow ache in your own jaw right about now. Not from inbreeding, but from imagining the quiet intensity of trying to look powerful while drooling slightly. That unfortunate image will come later, but even here at the humble start, you can sense the direction things are heading. Power, when pursued obsessively and hoarded too closely, warps everything it touches. Fringe historians still argue whether the jaw itself began showing signs this early. There are whispers in genetic retrospectives. Some believe a mild mandibular trait already existed in the early Habsburg bloodline, just waiting for the right romantic disaster to unleash its full potential. Others argue it only emerged after generations of inbreeding compounded recessive genes into what became a facial monument to poor decision-making. And poor decisions were just warming up. As you drift farther into this soft swirl of medieval ambition, imagine dinner at Hawke's Castle, pheasant on silver plates, flickering torches, a young Habsburg prince listening intently to court gossip, perhaps already calculating which cousin he might one day marry to double his land holdings. It's both romantic and mildly revolting. The scent of spiced wine lingers in the air, the candles burn low, and somewhere in the background, destiny clears its throat. The Habsburgs were never the flashiest family in Europe. They didn't have France's glamour or England's flair, but they had patience, land, and the cold-blooded instinct to marry their way into everything. Power by osmosis, with occasional help from a cathedral wedding and a dowry the size of a small kingdom. Even now, you start to sense that it won't end well. But isn't that what makes it perfect bedtime listening? Let yourself fall a little deeper now, lulled by the faint rustling of heraldic banners and the distant whinny of a princely steed. Somewhere beyond the trees, the Habsburgs are gathering. Their blood is concentrating. Their chins are lengthening. And you, dear sleeper, are just getting started. You wake, still dreaming, to the clop of horseshoes on cobblestone, and the sound of bells echoing over alpine valleys. Europe smells of wet parchment and wood smoke. The year is 1278, and you're at the battlefield of Marchfeld, where the Habsburgs, still relatively new to this whole destiny thing, are proving they can fight for it too. Rudolph I, remember him from the Hawke Castle, is now flexing his political muscles and, as it turns out, some military ones too. He defeats Ottokar II of Bohemia in a clash that leaves Austria open for the taking. And take it he does. You feel the future shift slightly beneath your slippers. The Habsburgs now hold Austria, the first real jewel in their long, uncomfortable crown. It's not glamorous yet. Think more muddy boots than marble palaces. But the foothold is enough. From here, they won't let go for centuries. Rudolph sets the tone for future Habsburg strategy. Don't waste energy conquering when you can just marry smarter. His descendants will perfect this into an art form so potent you could almost call it romantic blackmail. But here, in these earliest stages, they're still bootstrapping a dynasty from the ground up. There are dungeons to fill, taxes to invent, and cousins to impress. One of those cousins? Countess Gertrude of Hohenberg, Rudolph's wife. And you're right there at their candle-lit wedding feast, watching her give him 11 children and a suspicious number of reinforced bloodlines. You sip your mulled wine
and try not to notice the distant cousin they seated across from you is also next year's bride.
The Habsburgs were not yet genetically distinct, but they were already socially circular. Marriages became currency, and with each alliance, a new piece of Europe slid into their possession, like a very slow, very passive-aggressive game of Monopoly. Mainstream historians agree. This was the birth of the Habsburg marriage machine, an unstoppable bureaucratic romance generator that eventually linked them to nearly every noble house on the continent. But the weird part? It works. For centuries. You glide forward now, gentle and dreamlike, past Rudolph's descendants. Albert I, who gets assassinated by his own nephew. Frederick III, who coins the family motto, A-E-I-O-U. Historians still debate what it stands for. Some suspect it means all the world is subject to Austria. Others think it's just gibberish. Either way, it's painted on walls, coins, armor, and enough state documents to make it prophetic by sheer repetition. This is how dynasties inflate. Slowly, persistently. You expand your borders not by storming castles, but by outliving your enemies and marrying their widows. The Habsburgs soon begin popping up in unexpected places, claiming thrones in Hungary, Spain, even Burgundy. Their wedding invitations require folding maps. But all this power comes with an invisible price tag, the slow, inexorable tightening of the gene pool.
Fringe genealogists have pored over the family trees from this era, and the branches are alarmingly short. Second cousins marry first cousins. Nephews marry aunts. The Habsburgs aren't just weaving alliances. They're quilting their DNA into something increasingly tangled, like a beautiful medieval scarf that eventually starts to itch. Still, nobody's worried yet. At this stage, the portraits are flattering, the chins relatively modest. There's only the occasional jawline quirk, nothing an artist can't gently blur with oil paint and a bit of strategic lace. But you, knowing where this story leads, are already scanning faces for signs. That lower lip? A little full. That chin? Perhaps a bit prominent. You wonder when the artists will give up, when the brush will finally surrender to the bone. You're floating now above the early Habsburg capitals, watching them stitch Europe into a tapestry they intend to rule forever. Castles grow taller, marriages grow closer, and inside palace walls, the sound of destiny sharpening its jaw is almost too quiet to hear. Almost.
You blink, and now you're walking down a chilly palace corridor in late 15th century Innsbruck. Velvet drapes sway in the draft. Somewhere, a lute plucks out a tune no one's listening to. You've arrived at a wedding, but not just any wedding. This one reshapes Europe's family tree like a particularly aggressive gardener. Meet Maximilian I. He's tall, clever, athletic, and still able to close his mouth without effort. For now. Maximilian is the first truly modern Habsburg ruler, and he knows it. He wears plate armor with swagger, speaks several languages, and has a PR team of poets and artists who make him look like a knightly superhero. You watch him walk into the imperial court like he owns the place, and then you realize, very soon, he kind of will. But the real jaw-dropper here isn't Maximilian himself. It's whom he marries, Mary of Burgundy. She's not just any duchess. She comes with more land than most kings. Burgundy is the glitzy, wine-soaked jewel of the Low Countries, and Maximilian doesn't win it with a sword. He wins it by sliding a ring onto Mary's finger and inheriting one of the richest territories in Europe. You drift through their wedding like a ghost at a masquerade ball. Everything smells like powdered rose petals and ambition. The dancing goes late into the night, and you can almost hear the coins clinking behind every toast. This marriage is a jackpot, not just for love, though they do reportedly get along, but for the Habsburg dream of dominating Europe through holy matrimony.
Still, not everyone is thrilled. The French aren't fans. Neither are the Burgundian nobles, who find Maximilian too Austrian, too foreign, and possibly, just maybe, too ambitious. But Maximilian hangs on. He fights revolts, wins loyalty, and raises a son who will inherit not just his crown, but his cleverness and chin. Enter Philip the Handsome. Yes, that's his actual nickname. He's Maximilian and Mary's golden child, both literally and figuratively. You watch him ride through Brussels with his fashionable jawline and radiant hair, charming every noble he passes. People love Philip. Horses probably love Philip. You sorta love Philip. But the thing about handsome people in dynasties like this, they rarely stick around. Philip marries Joanna of Castile, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the famous Catholic monarchs of Spain. Yes, those two. The Inquisition folks, the Let's Fund Columbus folks. Joanna, like Mary before her, comes with baggage, and not just emotional. She's the heiress to Spain, Naples, parts of the New World, and more castles than you could count in one REM cycle. Historians still marvel at this level of accumulation without actual conquest. One of Maximilian's own court writers brags, "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." And now, the twist you've been waiting for. The gene pool just got a little warmer. Joanna and Philip are second cousins. Not a big deal in their time, but it starts something. A ripple. You can't see it yet, but it's there. In the DNA.
You float above their family tree like a slow-moving weather system. The branches begin curling inward. Their children will have inherited double doses of Habsburg blood, especially Charles, the boy who will grow up to become emperor of more than half of Europe. Charles is smart. Charles is pious. Charles is powerful. But Charles also starts showing signs. His jaw doesn't quite match the symmetry of his face. His mouth struggles to close fully. He has digestive problems and speaks with a slight lisp. And remember, this is the grandson of
the handsome. Historians still argue whether Charles inherited the jaw from his father, his mother, or some hidden grandparent gene lying in wait. But you, floating in Maximilian's candlelit shadow, you know it started here, with this glorious wedding, with this stunning merger, with this moment of ultimate dynasty building. The jaws of Europe inch closer to something both magnificent and tragic. As you drift away from the golden wedding chamber, the music fades, the torches dim, and the gentle clink of goblets gives way to a quieter sound. Teeth grinding ever so slightly out of alignment. The candlelight flickers again, and this time it reveals something stranger. You're now hovering over a family dinner in the early 1500s, except everyone at the table is related, deeply, uncomfortably. Consanguinity is the evening's true host. You pass your eyes across a line of solemn, high-born faces, and you can't help but notice those noses are a little too similar, those eyes nearly identical, and the chins, they're beginning to lengthen like shadows at dusk. Welcome to the tight, looping logic of Habsburg matchmaking, where love is less a lightning strike and more of a family spreadsheet. You hear the rustle of parchment. It's a marriage contract. You glance at the names: cousins, uncles, nieces. This isn't romance, it's empire management. By this point, the Habsburgs have developed a kind of addiction to intra-family marriages, a strategy born of paranoia and polished by bureaucracy. Marrying within the family helps keep claims intact, lands unified, and alliances predictable. Inheritance becomes less about chance and more about consolidation, like putting all your monopoly houses on boardwalk and then only playing with your cousins. This works until it doesn't. You're drifting now into the heart of this strange marriage matrix, and it's starting to feel claustrophobic. The Habsburgs' royal genealogy becomes a circle more than a tree. And as geneticists have confirmed centuries later, this loop has consequences. Severe underbites, elongated jaws, speech difficulties, and even mental health issues begin to show up in the descendants, especially in Spain. This is where you learn a fun fact. The term mandibular prognathism becomes practically synonymous with the Spanish Habsburg family. It means the lower jaw juts out beyond the upper, making it hard to bite, speak, or close your mouth fully. And in the Habsburg context, it doesn't skip generations, it stacks them like bricks. You observe, almost compassionately, the struggle behind royal tapestries. Children born to double cousin parents often had shockingly narrow genetic diversity. You'd expect about 50% variation in a child's teens when parents are unrelated, but in extreme Habsburg cases, that drops to as little as 10 to 15%. Some historians call the Spanish Habsburg family tree a genetic bottleneck. Others simply call it
a loop that never ends. Fringe researchers point to Maximilian's great-grandson, Charles V, as the first real warning sign. Remember him? The one with the empire on which the sun never sets? His jaw is unmistakable. Artists can't hide it anymore. Portraits reveal his heavy chin, slack mouth, and slightly awkward gaze. He's not monstrous, but he's certainly not symmetrical. And yet, Charles is still functional. He governs, he wars, he even abdicates power on his own terms. But he also passes on this jawline, like a slightly cursed heirloom. And so the next generation doubles down. Charles V marries his cousin, Isabella of Portugal. Their son is Philip II, who marries his own niece. And the niece? She's also a Habsburg, of course. You may need a nap, just to let that sink in.
Historians still argue whether these family-first marriages were truly based on political genius or simply a failure of imagination. Could they not find anyone else to marry? Was the pressure to keep power in the family stronger than the awareness of, well, biological consequences? One theory suggests that the Habsburgs genuinely believed divine will protected them, that their royal blood, ordained by God, would override any pesky genetic principles. Another proposes they simply couldn't bear the idea of outsiders gaining leverage. Better a broken jaw than a broken empire.
And so you lie back in your imaginary velvet pillow, imagining the matchmaking committees, parsing over family charts, trying to find the perfect balance between crown consolidation and, just maybe, a child who can chew solid food. You imagine a young Habsburg princess being introduced to her future husband at age 12. He's 14. They share the same grandmother. He gives her a carnation. She gives him a drawn-out sigh and a politically necessary smile. A dynasty is reinforced. A gene pool is tightened. The walls feel closer now. You can almost hear the soft echo of teeth misaligning across generations. It's not malicious. It's not even irrational. But it's undeniably tragic. What began as a clever strategy becomes a family tradition that eventually devours itself.
And still, nobody questions the system. You settle in, eyes half closed, knowing full well the worst is yet to come.
You wake just a little and find yourself standing in a grand, echoing hall. Every surface glints gold. Massive tapestries ripple on stone walls, and the scent of incense clings to every velvet-draped pillar. You are in the imperial court of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, Lord of the Netherlands, Archduke of Austria, and, unofficially, the first truly full-blown ambassador of the Habsburg Jaw. Charles stands before you, regal and impossibly burdened. His empire is so vast that messengers gallop from continent to continent just to keep up with his daily paperwork. But tonight, all you can see is that face painted in oil by court artists who had given up trying to correct anything. His jaw is unmistakable, long, heavy, jutting forward like a ship's prow. His lips don't quite meet. His chin stretches downward with almost architectural drama. It is not a caricature. It is simply his face. You sit beside him now at a quiet supper. You watch him struggle slightly with solid food, chewing carefully, speaking slowly. You notice the lisp, the tiredness in his eyes, the way he leans his face ever so subtly to one side, perhaps from years of compensation. He rules the most powerful empire Europe has seen in centuries, and yet his own body is already showing the cost of dynastic ambition. Charles V is a fascinating contradiction. On the one hand, he's brilliant, devout, diplomatic, multilingual, and absurdly powerful. On the other, he is fragile. He suffers from gout, epilepsy, and chronic fatigue. His doctors blame stress, fasting, genetics, and divine punishment, though probably not in that order. You float nearby as he writes letters to his son, Philip, warning him about the burden of ruling too much. He signs each with a weary flourish, sometimes smeared with wine, or the ink of frustration. Mainstream historians admire Charles for holding together such a vast empire, but they also note how quickly he gives it up. He abdicates in 1556, retreating to a monastery in Spain. There, among cork trees and solemn monks, he spends his final years building clocks and praying, and eating soft food. He dies jaw first, you might say. Fringe scholars like to joke that Charles stepped down because the empire became too heavy for one man and too heavy for one mandible. It's only partly a joke.
Now, drift with me to Philip II, Charles's son, the one born of Charles's cousin Isabella, thus adding another Habsburg twist to the helix. Philip inherits Spain, the Netherlands, and the Americas. His jaw isn't quite as dramatic as his father's, but it's clearly trending in that direction. He also inherits the Catholic zealotry, the melancholy, and the deeply formal court manners that will one day define the Spanish branch of the family. Philip, perhaps as an experiment in family tree folding, marries 4 times. One of his wives is Mary Tudor, Queen of England, creating a brief and awkward Anglo-Habsburg union. Another wife is his niece, Anna of Austria. That marriage between uncle and niece will produce Philip's son, the future Carlos II, the most genetically compromised ruler the Habsburgs will ever produce. But you're not there yet. For now, you're still sitting beside Philip, watching him pore over maps by candlelight. He's planning naval campaigns, dreaming of global Catholic dominance, ordering the construction of El Escorial, his austere palace monastery shaped like a gridiron to honor St. Lawrence, who was martyred on one. A nice reminder of how cozy religion and royal branding are in this dynasty.
Historians still debate whether Philip's coldness was natural or cultural. Was he emotionally distant because of his upbringing, or because his inbred bloodline made social interaction a bit more challenging? You hear rumors whispered among courtiers about his stiffness, his intense formality, the way he rarely laughed. But his portraits don't lie. The jawline is there. It has entered the chat. By this point, artists have stopped trying to soften it. In fact, Spanish royal portraiture becomes defined by it. El Greco, Titian, and Sanchez Coelho all leave you staring at increasingly elongated faces, high foreheads, sunken cheeks, and that unmistakable forward thrust of chin and lip. The Habsburg jaw is no longer a quirk. It's a dynasty-defining feature, practically a sigil. You float past these paintings in gallery after gallery, each frame a quiet testament to generations of strategic love gone wrong. And still, no one stops the pattern. Back in Philip's palace, you hear soft footsteps in the marble hallways. Another marriage contract is being drafted. Another cousin is being considered. Another heir is forming in the minds of ministers long before he ever forms in a womb. The jaw is no longer just physical. It's a legacy.
You don't wake so much as glide sideways, shifting from the dim corridors of Spanish palaces to the crisp, militarized air of the Austrian Alps. A falcon shrieks overhead. A priest nods silently from a chapel window. You're in Vienna now, where the Habsburg dynasty has, by this point, split into two sprawling branches: the Spanish line, ruled by Philip II and his descendants, and the Austrian line, where the empire marches on with a slightly different jawline. It's a dynastic divorce, really, one that began with Charles V's abdication. He gave Spain, the Netherlands, and the Americas to his son Philip. The Holy Roman Empire, Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary, went to his brother Ferdinand I. So now, you've got two groups of royals marrying their cousins, just in slightly different accents. You watch the Habsburgs stretch their arms eastward, marrying into Slavic, Hungarian, and even Ottoman-adjacent aristocracies. It's like watching a double-headed eagle, fitting because that's literally their family crest, peering in two directions, still believing they can devour all of Europe one betrothal at a time. But here's the curious thing. The jawline evolves differently in Austria. You float through portraits in Vienna's Hofburg Palace. The faces still carry that telltale chin, but it's milder. You see deep-set eyes, Habsburg noses, and the occasional unfortunate underbite, but not the catastrophic overgrowth you saw in Spain. Why? Historians still argue whether Austrian Habsburgs simply diluted the gene pool more successfully, or if the jawline mutation was somehow reinforced by the particularly extreme marriages of the Spanish side. You lean in close to a canvas, wondering if this countess's mouth closes naturally. Hard to say. The lace collar is doing most of the work.
Back in Spain, cousin marrying remains aggressive. Philip III marries his cousin, Margaret of Austria, merging the branches slightly, just in case the gene pool wasn't already a water hazard. Their son, Philip IV, will become infamous for his face, but we're not there yet. For now, you're drifting among formal dances in both branches of the family, where the waltzes are slow and the family trees are shaped like pretzels. At this stage, the Habsburgs rule vast regions of Central Europe, parts of Italy, the Low Countries, and colonial territories abroad. They're everywhere. But this expansion isn't driven by conquests as much as contracts. One Spanish princess marries into the Neapolitan court. An Austrian archduke woos a duchess in Milan. A Bohemian crown slips into Habsburg hands when a local king dies mysteriously without an heir. Or perhaps with an heir, but not one willing to marry his aunt. You peek into Habsburg bedrooms, chaste and uncomfortable. You examine their letters, full of duty, God, and very little flirting. It's clear now, these people didn't marry for love, they married for borders. And through it all, the jaw persists. In Spain, it lengthens. In Austria, it loiters. Either way, the genetic thread remains taut, pulled across treaties and tiaras.
You watch as both sides of the family begin to develop different reputations. The Spanish Habsburgs are pious, stiff, morose, more altar than ballroom. The Austrian branch, while still conservative, retains a bit more flamboyance, more art, more court intrigue, more tolerance for opera and scandal. Yet both are bound by the same grim philosophy. No one outside the family is truly safe to marry. You pass through a dining room in Prague where Ferdinand II is praying over boiled pheasant. He's preparing for the 30 Years' War, a religious bloodbath that will burn through Europe like wildfire. And yet, even as armies clash and cities starve, the marriage strategy continues, as if, deep down, the Habsburgs believe wars are just temporary. But genes are forever. Fringe scholars have noted that by the early 1600s, the Habsburgs begin showing signs of internal contradiction. Their portraits grow solemn, their diaries more paranoid. There's a sense of spiritual exhaustion, too many thrones, too few new ideas. You can almost hear the gears grinding inside the family machine, wondering how many more nieces are left to marry.
The split between Spain and Austria is official now, but the resemblance remains uncanny. If you lined them all up, from Madrid to Vienna, you'd see the same cheeks, the same solemn eyes, and the same noble jaws carved into history like tired granite. And yet, in your dreamlike haze, you can feel the tension building. The Spanish line is heading somewhere dark. The Austrian line will eventually reinvent itself. But here, in this exact century, both are still pretending everything is fine. You float above a ballroom where cousins lock eyes and destiny clicks shut like a jawbone.
The music plays on. Drift softly now into the quiet room where truth bends under brushstrokes. The walls are high, and the smell of linseed oil, candle smoke, and very expensive lies clings to the velvet curtains. You've entered the workshop of a Habsburg court painter, one of dozens employed over the centuries to perform a most delicate surgery, hiding the jaw. You lean over a half-finished portrait. It's Philip IV of Spain, staring back at you with droopy eyes, a long upper lip, and of course, that famous chin. Though the artist is doing everything he can to shave it down with shading, it's not working. This is the age of royal portraiture as political propaganda, and no family needs the illusion more than the Habsburgs. They aren't just rulers, they're walking billboards for genetic commitment. But as the jawline worsens, painters must choose between accuracy and flattery. And increasingly, they land somewhere in the realm of soft focus plus a collar the size of a dinner table. You stroll through the art galleries of time. One room in particular hums with soft candlelight. This is where Diego Velázquez paints Philip IV in the mid-1600s. You watch as Velázquez stares at the king, brushes poised. There's no hiding the asymmetry anymore, so he doesn't. Velázquez is bold, honest, loyal. His paintings reveal everything: the sadness, the solemnity, the jaw. It becomes a symbol in its own right.
Mainstream art historians have praised Velázquez for his courage and the eerie beauty with which he painted a king slowly breaking under the weight of his bloodline. But you know the truth. Every portrait is a tiny struggle between canvas and chin. Meanwhile, in Austria, a more flamboyant approach takes hold. Austrian Habsburgs lean into Baroque flourishes, dramatic poses, and fancier wigs. The jaw is still there, but it's draped in distraction. Artists like Hans van Aken and Giuseppe Arcimboldo paint rulers with enough frills and fruit to turn any anatomical oddity into background noise. You float from canvas to canvas. A young archduchess stands stiffly, her head tilted in a way that conveniently hides her jaw. A prince is painted in profile, only his good side, naturally. In group portraits, certain faces are partially turned away or draped in shadows. The brush becomes a scalpel. Reality is negotiable. Fringe theories abound. Some believe court painters were given subtle orders: make the jaw less prominent without removing it entirely. Others argue that royal patrons preferred their deformities to be present but subdued, a reminder of lineage, not a cause for alarm. You pause in front of one unfinished portrait. It's been painted over and over, the jawline adjusted 5 times. The artist's notes are scrawled in Latin, chin reduced, mouth reshaped, eyes downcast. Still resembles His Highness. Continue. You imagine the sigh behind every retouch.
But painting the Habsburg Jaw away was more than vanity. It was a state necessity. In a world where appearance equaled legitimacy, a malformed jaw could invite ridicule, doubt, or worse, uprising. A portrait didn't just hang on a wall. It traveled through marriage negotiations, foreign embassies, and generations. A bad chin could cost a crown. And yet, artists weren't magicians. By the mid-1600s, no amount of lace, oil, or idealized lighting could hide the biological truth. The jaw had become imperial. It stood for something larger, loyalty to blood, to dynasty, to a divine order that ignored modern genetics and leaned heavily on divine providence. Historians still argue whether this visual stubbornness helped prolong the dynasty or hastened its decline. Did these portraits reassure subjects that everything was under control? Or did they quietly confirm the rot behind the velvet? As you drift out of the gallery, you hear faint voices, the murmurs of modern-day museum-goers, chuckling softly at the exaggerations, unaware they are seeing the unfiltered truth, a truth the rulers themselves couldn't bear to confront. You pass a final portrait. It's not famous, just a minor Habsburg cousin, but the chin is unmistakable. And this time, the painter didn't even try to hide it. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he was honest. Or maybe the dynasty, by then, had accepted the jaw as its own form of crown. You leave the workshop quietly. Behind you, the smell of varnish fades. The jaw remains.
You descend now into the hush of a grand Spanish cathedral. Dust swirls in shafts of morning light, and every step echoes like a memory. The Habsburgs are in power, still, though the walls are starting to feel heavier, the ceilings taller, and the portraits more sorrowful. It's the 17th century, and the empire is still standing. But the faces leading it, they're beginning to crumble. Philip III, Philip IV, Charles II, names that rule vast domains, but behind the gold-threaded curtains, you find pale skin, slumped postures, and increasingly misshaped chins. You sit beside them in the silence, watching the Habsburg Jaw continue its work, one cousin marriage at a time. Philip III isn't particularly memorable. He lets ministers rule, prefers long religious ceremonies and longer siestas. But his jawline? Oh, it's there. Less dramatic than Charles V's, but enough to remind you that the family recipe hasn't changed.
He marries his cousin, Margaret of Austria, and together they ensure the blood stays neatly folded. Their son, Philip IV, is next. You join him now in the somber quiet of the Escorial, Spain's austere palace-monastery hybrid, a place so cold it feels like it was designed by an architect who hated joy. Philip IV is melancholic. The portraits show him with sad eyes and that same infamous chin
now bigger, squarer, and somehow more tired than before. He rules over a fading superpower. The Spanish Armada is gone. The colonies are expensive. Revolts stir in Portugal and the Netherlands. And yet, Philip responds not with reform, but with more cousin marriages. It's like trying to put out a fire by burning more matches. You glide through the palace halls, where his court, full of protocol, stiffness, and overbreeding, shuffles politely toward historical irrelevance. There are no fresh ideas here, just long lines of ancestry and the soft creaking of decaying greatness. Mainstream historians agree, by the time of Philip IV, the Spanish Habsburgs were more symbolic than strategic. His reign is a slow-motion fall. He sponsors the arts, thankfully. This is Velázquez's golden age. But he also continues his family's greatest mistake, closing the gates of the bloodline even tighter. You linger now in the nursery of his son, little Charles. You watch the nurses exchange nervous glances as they cradle the infant prince, fragile, trembling, already showing signs of something wrong. His forehead bulges, his jaw juts, he barely moves, and still the empire breathes a sigh of relief. A male heir. Fringe scholars point out a chilling truth here. The Spanish Habsburgs had painted themselves into a genetic corner. By Philip IV's time, every new child was essentially a genetic echo, a fuzzy photocopy of a photocopy of the same 6 ancestors. There were no new bloodlines left. The family tree wasn't branching anymore. It was curling inward. Yet they persisted, not out of cruelty, but out of devotion to tradition, to theology, to the illusion that divine favor protected their house from human frailty. You sit beside Philip IV at night as he reads letters by candlelight. The ink trembles in his hand. He knows his son is unwell. He knows his rule has faded. But still, he sends out marriage contracts. Still, he smiles for portraits. Still, he signs decrees with a flourish that no longer convinces even the page boys. Historians still argue whether Philip IV truly understood how fragile the Spanish Habsburgs had become. Was he naive, in denial, or simply powerless against the machinery his ancestors built? You feel the weight of it now, not just in your limbs, but in the heavy air of every palace chamber. The elegance is still here, but it's tired, worn at the edges. And that jaw, that relentless Habsburg jaw, continues to grow, not just as a feature of the face, but as a symbol of pride, of decline, of decisions made in candle-lit courts that no longer remember why they were made at all. And still, the carriages roll, the bells toll, and another wedding is planned. You're sitting quietly now in the boudoir of a dying empire.
The sun is low, and the windows of the palace glint with gold, but inside all is shadowed hush. You're with Charles II of Spain, El Hechizado, they whisper, the bewitched. And this is where the Habsburg story tightens into its final sorrowful knot. Charles II is the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, and though he rules a vast territory on paper, New World colonies, European dominions, fleets and fortresses, you wouldn't guess it from the man himself. His tongue is too large for his mouth. His lower jaw juts so far forward he can barely chew or speak clearly. His body is frail, legs bent, spine curved. You're told he didn't walk until age 8, and even then not confidently. You sit beside him as he tries to read aloud from a parchment, a royal decree maybe, but the words don't come easily. They stick. His voice is thick, breathy. The Habsburg Jaw, now in its most extreme form, is no longer a quirk of portraiture. It's a disability. Mainstream historians confirm what you already sense in the room. Charles's health problems weren't isolated. He suffered from multiple congenital issues, likely caused by generations of inbreeding. Fringe genealogical studies estimate that his inbreeding coefficient, a mathematical way to measure how genetically identical someone's parents are, was astonishingly high, comparable to the child of full siblings. And indeed, Charles was the product of uncle-niece marriage. You look into his eyes, pale, glassy, searching. His court tries to mask it with ceremony and incense, with processions and embroidered garments, but the truth is hard to perfume. Charles II cannot father children. He cannot produce an heir, and the empire holds its breath. There are debates, furious, whispered, and endless, among the king's advisors. Marry again, they say. Try this Austrian cousin, that French one. Maybe this one will work. But every new match is a roll of the same cursed dice, and the Habsburg Jaw has long since stopped gambling. You drift through the long, echoing corridors of El Escorial once more. Monks chant, advisors wring their hands. Outside, the world changes rapidly. New dynasties rise. Trade routes shift. Thinkers question everything. But inside these walls, time is stuck. Spain's throne waits, empty in all but name.
Historians still argue whether Charles II ever truly ruled, or whether he was more of a sacred object, something to be protected, hidden, and mourned, while others made decisions in his name. His mother, Mariana of Austria, essentially governed for years, and his ministers played delicate chess with foreign powers over what would happen when, inevitably, he died. And then, one day, he does. You're there, as the candle gutters beside his bed. His body, always thin, is now skeletal. He dies childless, jaw clenched, and at just 38 years old,
though you'd swear he looked 70.
There are rumors, always rumors, that black magic killed him, that witches cursed him. But you know better. The real spell was genetics. The curse was the cousins. And with his last breath, the Spanish Habsburg line collapses into history. But don't rise yet. Stay a moment longer in the silence, because even in death, Charles II ignites one more act, the War of the Spanish Succession. Every major European power wants a piece of the crumbling Habsburg inheritance. And it isn't decided by wisdom, or law, or divine intervention. It's decided by treaties, battles, and clever marriage claims. All the things the Habsburgs once mastered, now used against them. The empire they spent centuries stitching together with rings and weddings unravels in a decade. You slip out the palace door now, and for the first time in this journey, the Habsburg Jaw is quiet. Not gone. Just paused, waiting for the Austrian cousins to pick up the crown. Because, oh yes, this isn't over yet.
You're drifting now through misty alpine air, higher and colder than before. The Spanish throne may have cracked under the weight of its own genes, but eastward in Vienna, the Habsburg name still burns bright, glowing steadily in marble palaces and waltz-laced courts. The Austrian branch of the family, those same intermarrying cousins, isn't quite finished, not by a long shot. You settle into the Hofburg Palace, where chandeliers sway gently above powdered wigs and opera scores. It's the 18th century, and while Europe fights and redraws borders, the Austrian Habsburgs are staging something of a glow-up. Gone are the sickly airs and scandalous jaws. Well, not entirely gone, but toned down enough for public consumption. Here comes Maria Theresa. Ah, yes, Maria Theresa. Her name tastes like silver and hot chocolate. She's sharp, stubborn, devout, and politically shrewd. And yes, she's a woman, ruling in a world that often forgets women exist unless they're betrothed or buried. But Maria Theresa doesn't blink. She rules for 40 years, births 16 children, don't think too hard about that, and fights wars while nursing babies. Historians agree she reforms the military, improves taxation, and tightens the empire like a well-laced corset. But she also continues a tradition close to every Habsburg heart: strategic marriage. Her children become chess pieces scattered across Europe. One daughter becomes Queen of France, poor Marie Antoinette. Another marries into Naples. Another heads to Tuscany. And through it all, the jaw lingers, quieter now, but watching.
You sip mulled wine beside Maria Theresa as she reviews marriage prospects.
She's pragmatic. Emotion comes second to empire. You almost admire it. Almost. But even as the family expands outward, the Austrian Habsburgs can't resist the old ways. There are still cousin marriages, still DNA loops tightening like corset strings. Her son, Joseph II, tries to modernize things. He abolishes serfdom, challenges the church, and writes letters filled with Enlightenment ideals. But the Jaw waits patiently. It doesn't need Joseph. It has time. Fringe medical historians note something odd here. The genetic consequences seem muted in this generation, perhaps diluted by Maria Theresa's more varied gene pool. But her children still carry the markers: slightly prominent jaws, certain facial angles, fertility struggles. The traits haven't disappeared. They've just softened. You step into the Schönbrunn Palace Gardens now, where peacocks strut and musicians tune their violins. The empire feels theatrical, poised, like a salon mirror. But beneath the powdered wigs and layered silk, old problems simmer. Historians still argue whether Maria Theresa's reforms saved the empire or simply delayed its slow unraveling. She resisted religious tolerance, after all, and centralized power around a crumbling aristocracy. The structure was solid, but aging, like a ballroom chandelier just beginning to sway. And then there's her youngest son, Leopold II. He's reasonable, modest, and not particularly exciting, but he's useful. He steadies the ship. You sense that even he knows this dynasty is no longer destined to conquer, just to maintain, gently, until someone finally blows out the candles. But for now, the empire still dances. The salons are full, the treaty signed, the portraits touched up to minimize those distinctive chins. You look closer, though, and there it is again. That lower lip, that squared jaw, that whisper of 1,000 family reunions attended by the same people. You lean back on a velvet settee. The music swells, and the Habsburgs, still carrying their ancient name and ancient genes, prepare for yet another century of trying to balance tradition with survival.
You find yourself now in a darker, quieter Vienna. Gone is the lace and powdered pomp of Maria Theresa's golden age. Now the city is grayer, more solemn. The 19th century has arrived, and with it, a restless whisper. The world is changing. Monarchies, once towering and untouchable, are being questioned. And the Habsburgs? They're still here, still ruling, still clutching crowns with fingers just a little too old and brittle. You walk alongside a tall, melancholic man in a crisp military uniform, Franz Joseph I. He's emperor now, and will be for more than 60 years. The man is practically a wallpaper pattern in the grand halls of Europe, always there, always frowning, always trying to hold it all together. You watch him greet dignitaries with a tired bow. He's not flamboyant, he's not romantic, but he is, above all else,
diligent. He wakes at 4 a.m. every single day. He wears the same breakfast coat, eats the same dry toast, reads stacks of documents without ever smiling. And if you squint, you can still trace the ghost of the Habsburg jaw on his face, a little protrusion, a reminder. Genetics don't just disappear, they retreat, bide their time. Mainstream historians often treat Franz Joseph as the last real Habsburg emperor, the last to wield power with any meaningful grip. But they also agree his reign was plagued with personal tragedy. His son, Crown Prince Rudolf, dies in a grisly suicide pact at Meyerling. His beloved wife, Empress Elizabeth, Sisi, is assassinated by an Italian anarchist. His brother is executed in Mexico, wearing a paper crown sent by Napoleon III, and all the while, the empire he rules is a powder keg of nationalism. Hungarians want independence. Slavs want recognition. Italians want out entirely. And you're standing in the center of it all, listening to Franz Joseph breathe deeply and slowly, as though he can will it all into stillness. Fringe theorists love to point out that Franz Joseph's long rule might have masked the rot beneath. That by living so long, so stubbornly, he delayed the political reforms that might have saved the monarchy. And of course, there's his genetic legacy to consider. His nephew and heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, is the product of the same narrowing family tree. You see him now, Franz Ferdinand, pacing impatiently. He's different, modern, gruff. His jawline is strong, not grotesque, but you see hints of the old family signature. He marries for love, unforgivable. His wife, Sophie, is not of royal blood. Their children are technically not allowed to inherit. The old guard winces, the future's leaking in through the palace windows.
And then, one summer morning in 1914, you board an open-top car in Sarajevo. Historians still argue whether the Habsburg Empire was already doomed before that bullet struck Franz Ferdinand's neck. Maybe it was nationalism. Maybe it was bureaucracy. Maybe it was centuries of marrying your second cousin in hopes of avoiding war, only to create the perfect storm for the biggest one yet. But you don't argue. You just watch the Archduke's blood stain the folds of his uniform, and with it, something deeper begins to seep away. The Habsburg Jaw, once a symbol of strength, then a source of pity, now becomes a fossil, a relic of rulers who thought family alone could conquer time. You walk through the streets of Vienna again, but they're quieter. The cafes are still open, The music still plays, but something has shifted. The empire has just months left, and Franz Josef, impossibly old and unbearably tired, clings to his routines like a man gripping the banister of a sinking ship. And somewhere beneath it all, deep in the palaces and portraits and pedigrees, the Habsburg Jaw waits for the final act.
You don't hear the fall at first. It's quiet, dignified even. No bombs drop on Schönbrunn Palace. No mobs drag royal portraits through the streets. But the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that ornate patchwork of languages and loyalties, is collapsing just the same. The year is 1918. Franz Josef is dead, finally. And his grandnephew, Karl I, sits awkwardly on the imperial throne. He looks too young, too modern, too human. His chin bears the faintest ghost of that once mighty jawline, now more footnote than feature. You can almost hear the family tree groaning under the weight of too many names and not enough oxygen. Karl tries to save things. He sues for peace. He flutters around Vienna in a cloud of last-minute reforms and hopeful decrees. But it's too late. World War I has shredded the old order. Empires are out. Republics are in. Flags change overnight. Crowns tumble into velvet-lined trunks. And the people, many of them barely able to pronounce Habsburg, are too busy starving to care. You walk through a crumbling palace corridor. Staff quietly cover furniture with dust sheets. The empire has ended, not with a bang, but with a sigh.
Karl refuses to formally abdicate. He insists he was deposed. But he goes into exile anyway, eventually ending up in Madeira. Yes, Madeira, the same island you now drift through in misty daydream, where the former emperor coughs his lungs out from pneumonia in 1922. He's only 34. Mainstream historians often debate Karl's legacy. Was he a tragic reformer, a holy man doomed by circumstance, or just another overmatched Habsburg in a world that had outgrown powdered wigs? The Catholic Church beats everyone to the punch. In 2004, they beatify him. Yes, Emperor Karl becomes Blessed Karl, a saintly ending to a very mortal dynasty. You wander the ruins of the Austro-Hungarian court. Everything is gone. Hungary's independent. Czechoslovakia's a thing now. And Vienna has shrunk from imperial capital to regular old city. But the family? Oh, they don't vanish. The Habsburgs scatter like old perfume on lace. Still around, still recognizable, still clinging to history's edge. Some head to Switzerland, others to Spain. A few marry quietly, sell off jewels, write memoirs filled with half-remembered balls and softened memories. The jar? It lingers, here and there, like a half-buried sculpture in a neglected garden.
Fringe historians poke around here with delight. They point out that the genetic legacy of centuries of inbreeding didn't just disappear. It simply became private. You won't see exaggerated prognathism in portraits anymore.
because there are no more official portraits. But family photos? If you squint, you'll still catch that familiar angle of the chin, that stubborn set of the jaw. You sip espresso in a post-war Viennese cafe, watching life carry on. No more empires, no more coronations. But now, strange things begin to happen. Otto von Habsburg, Karl's son, becomes a member of the European Parliament. Yes, a Habsburg in Brussels. He gives speeches about unity and modernity, while carrying the memory of a crown that no longer exists. Historians still argue whether the end of the Habsburg Empire was inevitable, or if it could have evolved. But in your sleepy little corner of time, it feels like the natural conclusion of a very long dream. A dream embroidered with gold thread and shaped, literally, by one family's jawbone.
You tiptoe through a museum now, past armor and wedding portraits, maps stitched in Latin, echoes of a world that once was. And somewhere behind glass, a plaster cast of a Habsburg skull stares out at you, jaw prominent, teeth crowded, gaze eternally unbothered. That, you think, is how a dynasty ends. Not in fire, not in triumph, but in bone.
Now you stand in a modern Europe that barely remembers empires. Planes hum overhead. Trains zip across borders that once bristled with guards and guns. Nobody's checking royal lineage at the bakery anymore. But somewhere, nestled deep in the quiet folds of Austrian memory, the Habsburg name still echoes. And so does that jaw. You walk through the Habsburg family crypt in Vienna, where nearly 150 royals lie interred in elaborate metal coffins. Some are shaped like sarcophagi. Others are adorned with skulls, angels, and crowns. A hushed, candlelit quiet hovers over everything. You read names like Charles VI, Maria Theresa, Franz Joseph, and Empress Elizabeth, all of them still here, just horizontal. You pause at Franz Ferdinand's coffin and remember Sarajevo. You pause at Rudolph's and think about Meyerling. So much drama, tucked under so much marble. And then you remember, this is only part of the family. The Habsburgs had so many offspring, legitimate and otherwise, that mapping their full family tree is like trying to untangle spaghetti in the dark. Even today, amateur genealogists swap theories online, wondering whether some obscure baron in Slovenia is technically a Habsburg cousin 4 times removed. Mainstream historians still wrestle with the legacy. Was this the world's most successful ruling family? Or simply the longest-running genetic experiment? There's something eerily poetic about a dynasty that built itself through dynastic marriage, only to weaken itself with the same tool. A Mobius strip of political strategy.
But now you scroll through modern social media, yes, you do that even in bedtime history, and find Habsburg descendants with Instagram accounts. There's Eleanor von Habsburg, a jewelry designer and model. There's Karl von Habsburg, head of the house today. They do not wear crowns. They wear sunglasses, sometimes ski gear. And here's the real twist. Many of them are strikingly attractive. The Habsburg Jaw? It's pretty much gone. Diminished through generations of marrying outside the old bloodlines. Instead of jutting mandibles, you see sculpted cheekbones and runway smiles. It's like the ghost of that ancient chin finally decided to retire to a quiet villa in the Alps and stop haunting the gene pool.
Fringe theorists, however, aren't satisfied. They claim the jaw still exists, hidden, skipped a generation, ready to re-emerge if the right cousins meet at the wrong wedding. Some even joke that the Habsburgs buried their infamous chin somewhere under Schönbrunn Palace, like a cursed relic that pulses softly every time someone says Holy Roman Empire. You stroll through Vienna again, and now it's tourist-laden and cheerful. Horse-drawn carriages circle the old imperial streets. Souvenir shops sell CC snow globes and Franz Josef fridge magnets. The dynasty that once ruled vast swaths of Europe now sits comfortably on keychains and tote bags. But you feel it, that strange sensation of walking alongside ghosts. The knowledge that for centuries one family shaped the destiny of millions and left behind not just palaces and portraits, but a medical mystery embedded in the human skull.
You duck into a quiet library, and there it is, a medical textbook. Inside, a full-page spread on mandibular prognathism. And yes, it references the Habsburgs. You've gone from royal decree to clinical case study. That's history's final joke. You're no longer a king, you're a diagram. Historians still argue whether the Habsburg jaw was caused by pure inbreeding, or whether other factors played a role. Isolated genetic mutations, poor nutrition, even epigenetic responses to chronic family trauma. But the symbol remains powerful. The jaw became a stand-in for all the empire's contradictions, mighty yet fragile, noble yet grotesque, eternal yet doomed.
And you smile softly as you pass a mirror in the library hall. Your own reflection stares back. A regular jaw, a regular person. But for a moment, you wonder what it would feel like to wear a crown, marry your cousin, and rule from a throne propped up by sheer stubbornness. Spoiler, it probably wouldn't end well. You drift now into the strange limbo between memory and myth. The dynasty is gone, the bloodlines scattered, and the jaw, once mighty enough to hold up a continent, is reduced to a trivia fact and a few faded oil paintings. But history is never truly finished. It lingers in the folds of museum velvet, in names engraved on plaques, and in dinner table anecdotes you didn't realize were centuries old. You're walking through the Kunsthistorisches Museum now, past vast halls of golden frames and unnervingly straight posture. Here's Charles V again, staring down from canvas, his chin like a drawbridge, and next to him Philip II, whose profile looks like it was carved by someone with a square ruler and a grudge. Tourists snap selfies. The audio guide offers no mention of inbreeding, just glory, empire, triumph. But you know better. You linger in the portrait gallery, and something catches your eye. A lesser-known archduke, too minor to be taught in schools, but his expression is haunted. The lower jaw juts, the lips press awkwardly together, and the eyes seem to say, "Please don't marry me off to my niece again." And suddenly it hits you. These weren't just rulers. They were people. People who played harpsichord and sneezed and had favorite wines. People born into a system so convoluted and self-replicating it left them no way out. To preserve their name, they had to risk their health. To keep the crown, they had to marry someone with the same great-grandparents again.
Historians still argue whether the Habsburgs were victims of their own ambition or its most determined architects. Was it inevitable that they'd bend the laws of genetics to preserve dynastic purity? Or did they cling to tradition long after it stopped serving them? You step into a replica of Empress Elizabeth's salon. Everything is dainty. Hairbrushes, diaries, love letters sealed with wax. You think about how many of the Habsburgs died young. How many ended their days in monasteries, asylum wards, or foreign palaces surrounded by servants who didn't speak their language. A fringe museum plaque, barely noticed, mentions a theory that the Habsburgs understood the curse of their jaw. That late in the dynasty, they began quietly seeking partners with corrective features, hoping to breed the trait out before the tabloids of the day caught on. Whether this worked is debatable, but the desperation, very real. And now you're back outside, standing beneath the great equestrian statue of Joseph II. Tourists drift past, unaware of how many collapsed lungs and receding chins it took to get that statue made. You smile a little. It's all so absurd, so regal, so doomed. And yet there's something beautifully human about the whole saga. A family trying again and again to hold on to power, beauty, meaning, and failing in the most operatic way possible.
You walk slowly now. The streets of Vienna wrap around you like a lullaby. The lights are soft. The history is heavy, but somehow comforting. You don't need to remember every emperor's name.
just the way their faces lingered in your memory. A bit crooked, a bit tragic, and very, very tired. The Habsburg Jaw is gone. But the story, that stays with you.
Night deepens as you settle into the final stretch of the story, and your mind drifts to the strangest part of all, how something as small as a jawline could hold so much history. You blink slowly. Somewhere between legend and lab lotes, the mighty Habsburg Dynasty has folded into its own bedtime tale. You imagine yourself standing in the Spanish countryside, wind brushing against your cheeks as the sun sets behind El Escorial, that somber and severe palace monastery built by Philip II. Its geometry is ruthless, like a chessboard made of stone. Inside, in the dim corridors and whispering chapels, lay the bones of kings who couldn't chew properly. They ruled the world and yet struggled to close their mouths. That, right there, is history's most ironic comedy. You think back to Charles II of Spain, the sad crescendo of the Habsburg experiment. His head was too large. He drooled. He couldn't talk until age 4. His first teeth came in at age 8. And despite all this, he was king of one of the world's most powerful empires. Every time he opened his mouth, the fate of continents hung in the balance. And sometimes he couldn't physically close it again. That wasn't just tragic, it was theatrical. A whole continent paused, holding its breath, to see whether this young man with the facial geometry of a distressed melon would produce an heir. He did not. And the empire splintered like an old mirror. Mainstream history books call it the War of Spanish Succession. But you call it the moment a jawline triggered global upheaval. Because let's face it, no Habsburgs, no jaw, no succession war, history gets a lot more boring.
Historians still argue whether the Habsburg line truly died with Charles II or just quietly diffused into Europe's aristocratic haze. But what's undeniable is this: the chin that ruled Europe fell silent after him. The silence was oddly peaceful. Today, there are thousands of people, maybe millions, who carry trace amounts of Habsburg DNA. Most will never know it. Some might notice a slightly protruding lower jaw and make a passing joke. Others might sit in biology lectures or orthodontist chairs and stumble upon the name mandibular prognatism, unaware that their very bite connects them to crusades, coronations, and cousin marriages. And you? You close your eyes now and imagine walking through a dream palace lined with family portraits. Each face turns slightly as you pass. There's Charles V, looking like a troubled eagle. There's Maria Anna, beautiful and bewildered. And behind them, corridors of velvet-curtained silence, where powdered wigs and heavy crowns weigh down the air itself. A fringe theory whispers that the Habsburgs never really vanished. They simply retreated to the quiet places of Europe. Deep libraries, mountaintop chalets, private train compartments, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge chin first. It's nonsense, of course, but bedtime stories are allowed to stretch a little.
So you walk onward in that grand imaginary palace, past thrones, past treaties, past crumbling family trees, until finally a door opens and the wind down begins.
Now everything softens. The portraits dim, the footsteps fade behind plush rugs and dustless marble. The empire quiets down, as all empires eventually must. Even the sharpest jaws lose their bite with time. The halls stretch longer, the ceilings higher, the light more golden and sleepy. You pass old tapestries now, depicting lion hunts, coronations, awkwardly posed family weddings, and they ripple slightly in the warm hush of evening. Your mind drifts slower and slower through the story you've just walked, not just of rulers and wars, but of faces, of bloodlines winding tighter and tighter until they finally broke. You feel no judgment here, just a slow compassion for a family that tried for centuries to keep something eternal, even as the cost showed on their faces. The wind outside is gentle now. Somewhere far away, a horse's hooves echo on cobblestone. You're not in Vienna or Madrid anymore. You're simply here, in the quiet space between history and dream. Breathe in, breathe out. Let go of the palaces. Let go of the treaties, let go of the chin. And in this softened, velvet dark place, let your thoughts fall like snow. No need to follow them, no need to remember the names. Only the slow, sleepy idea of a world once ruled by bone and crown. Good night.